I strongly believe that God has a sense of humor. Part of that is, well, just where do we get it from? It has to come from somewhere. But I was reminded of that this morning. I ran up here to the building to do a couple of things to get ready for this morning, and I was on my way home. And as you can see on the screen, we're talking about marriage and conflict resolution. So I'm scanning the radio station, and right when I pull into my driveway, the song comes on, "I'm going through the Big D and don't mean Dallas." So, I don't really know what all that means. But anyway, God did intend marriage to be a place of safety and serenity, to create a home. A home, by the way, sometimes biblically speaking, sometimes people will say to a young couple that maybe doesn't have children, when are you going to start a family? Or when are you going to start a home? You are a family. The second you are married, you are a family and you are a home. The presence of children just multiplies the amount of people that are in that home or in that family. And so he intended them to be places of safety and serenity, especially in a world that is extremely difficult and can be very chaotic, that the home is a place where we come to and it's where we can kind of escape all of the things that go on in the world. Unfortunately, sometimes, though, in marriages and in homes, it's more like you come home to more of the same. It's chaotic. It's a war zone. There's always turmoil. There are always things going on. And the question is, how do we get out of that cycle? Because one of the things we learn about conflict is that it will come in cycles and it will continue to repeat itself. If we don't do something to break that cycle, we can actually get into that habit. And that's not something that God intended for us. Now, conflict is inevitable. It doesn't matter what relationship you are in, conflict is inevitable, okay? And so the idea, people say, well, it would be great if we never disagreed. Well, let's be honest. In a sinful world, that's a little pie in the sky and unrealistic. That's not going to happen, okay? Yes, it would be great, but that's not our reality in a sinful world. So the question is, how are we going to handle the conflict? You see that conflict come very early when you see Adam and Eve, and they sin, and Adam very quickly throws Eve under the bus. There's conflict, the brokenness of that human relationship that's already taking place. Now, when it comes to conflict, sometimes in marriage relationships, sometimes people think that a good marriage is the absence of conflict. I would actually argue quite the opposite. There's nothing that really scares me more than a marriage where you don't have, and by conflict I mean disagreement. It doesn't mean you have to have all-out wars and fights and we're abusing one another, but where we don't have conflict, where we don't have differences between the two people, that concerns me at a number of different levels. One of which is usually what that means is if there's no conflict, that one has so dominated the other that they have basically just laid down and given up and are just not going to rock the boat. And so that's not a really good sign, in my opinion, because two people who are broken in sinfulness, they cannot always be right, and they're not always going to see eye to eye on everything, so there has to be disagreement, okay? And we have a responsibility in helping our spouses become more like Jesus to disagree with them when they do something that is not right, or when they believe something or they say something that is not right. We have that obligation to push back against that notion. We're to sharpen one another and to make one another better. It's unloving to let a person, especially the person to whom we've entered a covenant and pledged ourselves to before God and before others, to let them go on in sinful behavior without ever saying anything to them in the process. So, we want to think about conflict resolution in marriage this morning. And again, this is not, if you really hate this sermon, I'll be honest with you, Brooke wrote it, so just direct your anger accordingly, okay? But as I always say when we're talking about marriage, listen, be cautious of so-called marriage experts. They have decent things. I have several of their books, as you do too. But remember that they're flawed, and many of them, and I'm not opposed to modern psychology or psychiatry, I believe in it, but you have to understand that they're operating from an atheistic framework as their foundation, okay? And so some of the approaches that they put forth may not necessarily be the best. Just sidebar, one example. One of the most famous relationship books over the last 20, 30 years has been His Needs, Her Needs by Willard F. Harley. Now, Harley goes on a basic counseling method called the love bank that so often you make when you interact with a person, it's like a transaction. You either make deposits, which are good feelings toward the individual, or you make withdrawals, negative feelings, and your love bank feels up and down. And I get the premise of what he's saying, but biblically speaking, he gives the idea that says you should only do good to people when they do good to you, and that's not something biblically we can endorse. So you have to be cautious when you're reading and read it through the lens of Scripture. Now, what we're dealing with, the Bible doesn't have a lot to say as far as specific examples. Here is a marriage, here was their conflict, and this is how they resolved it. There's one that we kind of see a little bit of in Song of Solomon 5. And so what we're dealing with, though, as we think about this subject this morning, are principles that we draw in general that the Bible says concerning conflict resolution. Sometimes that resolution may be in marriage, sometimes it may be in church settings, but the premise of conflict resolution is all throughout Scripture, isn't it? I mean, isn't the Bible one big story of God resolving the conflict that exists between Him and sinful people? And so we're going to be dealing with principles as we walk through these things, but I want us to do this in 3 stages. Number 1, I want us to talk about things that we should never do. If we engage in these things, and listen, every one of us, if we would be brutally honest, every one of us are probably guilty of every one of the things we're going to say today. Okay? But the point is not that we just dismiss it, but the point is that we understand that what we're doing is not right, and we move and we work on deleting those behaviors, okay? We're trying to progress in relationships. And so we want to look at things under the headings of things that we should never do. These are things that we have to delete. We have to find a way to cut them out, okay? And it'll cause us to make a lot of personal reflection on how we interact with people. Then there are some things that we don't do. Okay? We're going to, but they're not necessarily as detrimental to a relationship under the headings of never do. And then we want to talk about some things that we should do when we have a conflict come up. So, number 1, some things we should never do. Number 1, never fight with children around or present. Never fight with children around or present. Or for that matter, even other people. Public disputes between a husband and wife are absolutely inappropriate. Okay? Matthew 18:15, the principle of reconciliation still is, moreover, if your brother shall trespass against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Now, if God has that premise of the way that Keith Balch and I interact about our disagreements, surely He believes that the way I interact with my wife about that should be based upon the same premise. That's not something we take public. And when we look more specifically as our children being around or present, one of the reasons why we don't do that and why it is so dangerous is because children have a unique ability to make problems about which their parents fight their own. And so what we end up doing is we put adult issues on children's shoulders. And they don't have the capacity and they don't have the framework to deal with those issues the way that adults do. And so when we fight when they're present, we're burdening them. Let me just give you a simple example. Let's say you're excuse me. As a married couple, you're having a disagreement about finances. How we should spend money, or we're spending too much money in this area, or we're spending too much money in that area, or not enough. Either way. So a child overhears this. Now, this is the way children operate. So a child may hear that, we're spending too much money, we don't have enough money. Well, maybe if I hadn't gotten that new pair of shoes for school and hadn't gone back to clothes shopping, Mom and Daddy wouldn't be fighting about money. Or maybe if I hadn't asked to go out to eat last week and we went, we would have enough money. Now, you and I both know in the grand scheme of things, taking our family out to eat isn't keeping us from paying the mortgage, but a child doesn't have that ability to understand that. And so when we do that in front of our children, we burden them with those particular issues. Furthermore, we create a sense of insecurity within them. Mom and dad need to be the bedrock of stability. It doesn't mean we can't disagree, but we don't need to have major disagreements, certainly, in the presence of our children, because number one, they're not capable to handle it, but number two, it's primarily just not their business. Okay? So, number two, never yell at your spouse. Under no circumstance is this okay. Okay? Now again, if most people would be honest, if you could get people to be honest with you, I think every person would admit they were guilty of it. But it doesn't make it okay. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 31, he talks about things that Christians are to put away, and the ESV renders it clamor. I think the King James actually renders it something similar, but I think the New King James actually renders it loud quarreling, yelling matches, fighting. And you know, in some homes, when mom and dad disagree, that's what they become. When husband and wife disagree, they become yelling matches. Now, there are a number of different reasons why we don't yell. First and primarily because it's flat out disrespectful. Okay? It's flat out disrespectful to yell at another person. But another reason why we don't do that is because, number one, it does not help us solve the issue. How many people have you ever seen sit down across from a table, yell at one another, and truly resolve an issue? Because what we need, what we now know when we study the way that the brain works and the different parts of the brain that are in charge of certain things, what we know is, so to solve a problem, and this has been studied in workplace areas, so to solve a problem, what we need for our employees to have in their minds is the area that controls their critical thinking, which allows them to analyze, assess, and produce solutions. But when they studied bosses who were condescending and yelled at their employees, the part of the brain that handles critical thinking, which they need to solve the problem about which the boss is yelling, that part shuts down, and the part that's ignited is what is called fight, flight, or freeze. It's the lowest form of thinking. For an example, as a parent, have you ever seen your child doing something, yelled for them to stop, and then they just freeze in what they're doing, and you say, "Why are you just standing there?" Because you just activated the part of their brain that said, "Don't move." That's what yelling does. It activates that part of the brain. So now they're getting in second trouble for doing something in their brain that you've activated through your yelling. Now, in a marriage relationship, when you've got a husband and a wife yelling at one another, how much high-level critical thinking can really happen to solve the issue that's created the disagreement? You can't, because that part of your brain is actually shut down. And you know, we can make excuses for why we yell, but here's something we have to understand. Yelling is not in our DNA. It's not like you look at our DNA and there's a yelling strand and you just got no control over it. We have control over it. It's an impulse control issue. And so we stay away from yelling because it's not conducive, it's disrespectful, and a host of other issues that come up with it. Number 3, we never walk out. We never walk out. Now, let's qualify this a little bit. And when you look at Song of Solomon 5 and verse 6, she goes to answer the door. And she says, "I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. My soul failed me when he spoke. I sought him, but found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer." And so, in this context, he's come in late at night, and she's already locked the door and gotten ready for bed, and he's trying to get in, but she doesn't want to get up, and we'll deal with this more here in just a little bit. But she doesn't want to get up and open the door, and so eventually he just walks away and leaves. She gets to thinking about it and says, that's not right, and she has compassion because she hears him trying to open the door, and he can't get in, and she goes to try and open the door, but he walks away and leaves. Now, she certainly was not right in what she did. She exhibited selfishness. But I don't believe he was right either in walking away. Now, let's kind of caveat this and nuance this a little bit. Depending upon how your relationship dynamic works and how your personality works, you may need to take a breather for a second and cool down. Okay? That's not what I mean by don't walk out. I mean, don't leave the house. Don't get in your car and go driving somewhere. Or every time a problem goes up, we just immediately withdraw and walk away and run away. Because you can't solve a problem that way. And and to be honest with you, if we're just being flat out honest, it's childish behavior to say, you hurt my feelings and now I'm running away. That's the equivalent of saying, you hurt my feelings, I'm taking my toys and I'm going home. Marriage is not intended for adolescents, it's intended for adults who can handle conflict and can work through those conflicts. And so walking out will not fix the issue. And so that's something that we do not do. Number 4, never ever threaten divorce. Never ever threaten divorce. I'm not saying, listen, with a sermon like this, we're speaking in broad generalities. I can't nuance it to every single possibility in marriage and every single circumstance. That's just absolutely impossible to do in a setting of more than 100 people, where you have probably 30, 40, 50 marriages. You can't nuance a study like that to each individual situation. You just can't. But I do know that threatening divorce is never a good thing to do. And it may come as something like this. We get mad and we say to the other, I'm going to walk out that door and never come back. Or if I'm such a bad person, why don't you go find somebody else? Guys, that's a threat for divorce. And what it really is a scare tactic by the person who's saying it. That's really what it is. By saying, you see, some people, they thrive and they guilt people and manipulate people to get them to do what they want to do. And so they know this person is sensitive to this premise, and so they threaten divorce. They go nuclear when they're trying to deal with an issue. They go nuclear instead of simply trying to practice diplomacy. They just threaten to blow the whole thing up instead of actually working through the issue. And so they end up threatening divorce. Now, here's the problem. At some point, the devil is going to continue to that seed has already been sown, okay? So when we make that statement, that's a seed we sow in the minds of our spouse. And it's also a seed that we sow in our own minds. And I promise you this, the devil will water that seed. The devil will water that seed. And one day, what was just a get you moment in marriage might turn out to be the end of your marriage because the devil watered it. And he treated it as a possibility. But here's something. The Bible still says, God said through the prophet Malachi that God still hates divorce. Malachi 2 and verse 16. And he also said, and Jesus said in Matthew 19 and verse 6, what God has joined together, let no man separate. We ought not threaten to separate what it is God has joined together. That's not right. And furthermore, a number of different issues go along with that. And one thing that I have seen play out before is eventually one spouse will call the other spouse's bluff on it. That is, the one who always threatens divorce, eventually the person who is threatened with divorce all the time will finally say, then just go do it. And the person who keeps threatening divorce doesn't really mean it, but they say it just to kind of win the argument. And then they get stuck in their pride and say, well, I can't tell them I haven't been telling the truth this whole time, so I guess we'll just have to go ahead and get divorced. And so you got two people getting divorced who still want to be married to each other, but they can't swallow their pride. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it all started because they threatened divorce. Next. Never go to bed angry or unresolved. Paul talks about this in Ephesians 5 in discussing anger. He says, be angry and do not sin. It's okay to be angry. God never said it was wrong to be angry. But there is a line at which anger becomes sin. He said, be angry and don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. That is, address the issue and work through it. Address the issue and work through it. So, and then he follows it by this statement, neither give place to the devil. What's he saying? Anger unaddressed is giving the devil a foothold in your life. Because he will take that and you will begin to spin upon that. You know, he really said that. And you know, that's not the first time he said something like that. And you know what? Why would he really say that? If he really loved me, why would he say that? I guess he must not really love me. I mean, what was I thinking after all when I got married to him? I mean, I should have known this. Even when I think back to when we were dating, he would say something like this. Do you see what a person is doing? They're driving themselves and spiraling themselves down into a hole from which they will never recover. Furthermore, not realizing that on that whole spiral, they're not remembering correctly because they're emotional. They're not reading things correctly because their emotions have taken over. And so the next time the individual does it, they say, well, there it is. There's the sign that we shouldn't be married. Listen, that's not adult behavior. That's not adult thinking. But it happens because we won't address an issue. Now, let me say this. Sometimes issues are too big to solve before you go to bed. If we're just being flat out honest about it, they're just too big. But we can at least reach a place, okay, where we can put in a plan and say, look, we've talked about this and we're just kind of going in circles right now, and we're tired and we're both a little emotional about it. I think the best thing we could do is go to sleep. We'll meet back here tomorrow at this time and we're going to talk about it some more. But we're not going to carry animosity. We're not going to be mad at each other. We're going to try and figure out how to solve the problem. And that's how we're going to go forward. So we still go to bed with the understanding that our relationship has met a challenge, but we're not in trouble. And we're not angry at one another. We're not harboring bitterness. But we are agreeing that we need to take a step back and we'll try and solve it at the next step. But don't let it go. You have to be faithful to the commitment to continue to work through it. Then finally, number whatever this is, don't tell your problems to others. Now, by this, I don't mean you can't go to a marriage counselor and seek help. I'm not saying if you're being physically abused, stay there and take it and don't tell anybody. That's not the point. You and I both know, though, on the whole, that this principle is violated all the time when kids, they get married and they run home and they tell their parents everything that's going on in their relationship, and it should not be done. Because here's the honest truth. A parent cannot be an objective third party to their child's marriage. It can't happen. Furthermore, it's not my parents' business what's going on in my marriage relationship. It's just not their business. Furthermore, people say, well, I'm going to talk to some of my friends about it. Well, first of all, it's a bad idea because, again, they're not in the relationship, and so they don't have the same stake claimed, and they don't have the full understanding of what's going on. But that's beside the point. But usually the friends that people talk to, the advice they give is so monumentally bad. And I'm not trying to be ugly when I say that, but it is so monumentally bad that it's just unfathomable. Well, you know, sometimes people just fall out of love. Think so? When I hear that statement, that tells me that the individual who makes the statement understands nothing about love the way God describes it. A friend of mine who preaches in Hoover, Alabama, who's I don't know how old he is now, he's probably in his 50s. But he has said many times, I've heard him say it many times, if a man comes to me and sits down in my office across my desk from me and says, I don't love her anymore, he said, my first question to him is going to be, when did you decide it was okay to start disobeying God? Because the Bible says, husbands, love your wives. Imperative. It's not a choice. Love is not how we feel. We have got to kill that lie. Love is what we do. It is a commitment that we make and nothing else. And if we do that, the feelings will come. But if you're relying on feelings to dictate whether or not you're in love, good grief. It's impossible to describe the type of emotional disorder that would be. And so we don't involve other people because everybody gets involved and everybody starts putting in their 2 cents. Most of them haven't got a clue what they're talking about. Their 2 cents is actually negative 2 cents. I mean, it's worthless. And furthermore, it's not God ordained. So, it ends up turning into problem after problem. So those are some things we never ought to do. And if we do them, we need to stop, we need to make apologies, we need to make amends. So now let's move to some things that we don't do. Not saying that these things are good, but again, they are some things we definitely need to avoid. Number one, don't be selfish in solving a problem. Selfishness is the number one reason. Song of Solomon 5. Here he is in verse 2. I slept, but my heart was awake. A sound, my beloved, is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is wet with the dew, with the locks, and my locks with the drops of the night. And she says, but I had put off my garment. How could I put it on? I bathed my feet. How could I soil them? What is she saying? I'm already ready for bed. I'm already in bed. I can't get up and come let you in. Now look, on this occasion, she's the one in this play, in this story in Song of Solomon 5, she's the one who's being selfish, but it could just as easily have been him. It's just the way it's written on this one. But it's selfishness. It's the premise that says, I want it my way, that you're going to do it. You're going to see it my way. And when that happens, we're going to run into a lot of problems. And furthermore, it goes against everything that we are supposed to be as Christians. Think about Galatians 5 and verse 13, that through love we serve one another. We don't demand our own way, we serve people. And isn't it amazing that we can serve complete strangers, but we can't find in ourselves the ability to serve the person to whom we've pledged our lives? We can hold our tongue around strangers, but we can't hold our tongue. We can't temper our words around people that we love. Or as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, giving the characteristics of love, love does not insist on its own way. Here's a news flash that every one of us need to get, myself first. I'm not always right. And my way is not always best. It is possible that I can look at a situation and misjudge it. And so I have to interact in a disagreement with humility. Part of being an adult when we have a disagreement is saying, is there something that I'm not seeing in this situation? Am I wrong? Am I willing to even entertain the possibility that I might be wrong in this disagreement? Because if I'm not, I mean, that's a huge problem at so many different levels. So this is what I would say when it comes to not being selfish. Seek a solution. Don't seek to win. And that's the problem. When two people go and they disagree, when two spouses disagree, they're trying to win. Listen. For you to win, your spouse has to lose. Now, if it were in sports, it would make sense. You have a winner and you have a loser. But in marriage, when two people become one, if one of you loses, you both still lose. You both still lose. So it can't be about winning. It's got to be about solving. Number 2, don't get historical. No, that's not a misprint. I don't mean hysterical, I mean historical. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, describing the characteristics of love, Paul uses an accounting, a word taken from the world of accounting that says love does not keep a record of past mistakes. That is, when we get into a disagreement, we say something, I remember you did this on this day, and you did this on this day, and you did this, and you said this, and you did this, and you did. It's historical. So we've got a number of issues that we need to take care of. Biblically speaking, number 1, we need to be asking ourselves, why is it that you're still throwing up old things that have been addressed and forgiven? Why are you still throwing them at him or her? because that's not biblical. If they were forgiven, it means you don't bring them up. So we're not keeping a record book of past mistakes. But furthermore, think about this. What if God treated us like that? What if every time we came to God seeking forgiveness and he said, you know, I'm getting a little tired of this. Yesterday I forgave you of this, this, and this. And then the day before that I did this, this, and this. If you look back 3 years ago, it was this, 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 and this. And 5 years ago, it was this, 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 and this. We don't need to get historical because it's not helping the problem at hand. Now, the only exception that I could see to that would be if we have a spouse and our spouse is struggling with some kind of an addiction, right? If they're struggling with an alcohol addiction, or if they're struggling with a pornography addiction, or they're struggling with something along that, and what we're trying to do is establish a pattern of behavior to show them that they've got a problem, that's a little bit different than what we're talking about. But just in general, where we're disagreeing, we don't have to get historical. We don't need to. Number 3, don't pretend that you can read minds. Don't pretend that you can read minds. 1 Corinthians 2:11 through 13, Paul said, what things knoweth the things of a man, save the spirit of man who is in him? Even so, no one knows the things of God except the Spirit of God who is in him. And the illustration that he's making that we've talked about several times before is, you can't know what I'm thinking until I tell you. We cannot look at our spouses in a disagreement as we're trying to make a case and we're trying to read their face and we say to them, I know what you're thinking, because you don't know what they're thinking. God says you can't read minds. God says I can't read minds. Stop saying that. It's not helpful and it's not biblical, because we can't read. We don't know. We have to learn to take people at their word and to communicate with our word. And furthermore, well, a lot of different issues. But we're going to have to pick this up tonight. Time slipped me. Too many other things to say. These are things that we're needing to avoid. We need to keep back. And so if we'll do these things, if we will eliminate fighting around other people, yelling at our spouse, walking out, threatening divorce, going to bed unresolved and harboring resentment, and telling our problems to the world, I promise you, if we'll just master the things in never, our marriages will instantly increase in flourishing. But if when we have conflicts, we can remind ourselves not to be selfish, not to try and win, but to try and solve, things become easier. And if we avoid getting historical and throwing up all their past mistakes in their face, and we stop believing that we are God Himself and we can read their minds, we're on the track to solving some problems here. And one of the things that we know definitely is that with the resolution of conflict, when a couple goes into conflict, when they resolve it, do you know what happens on the other side when they resolve it correctly? Greater intimacy is achieved between husband and wife. Greater intimacy is achieved. They become closer. And if you think about it, biblically speaking, doesn't that make sense? We sinned against God. God reconciled us to Himself in Christ, 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 21. And now we have a close, intimate, loving relationship with God based upon that resolution. We're closer to Him than we ever could have been, because we've experienced that difficulty. We've experienced the separation, and now we're together. And as we walk with God continuously, as we make our mistakes and God forgives us, our heart grows more and more for who God is and His willingness to forgive us in such a vast way. It creates intimacy. Because ultimately, didn't Paul say in Ephesians 5 that our marriages are really supposed to be pictures of what? Of Christ's love for the church. And if we do these things, we can become that. This morning, if a person is outside of Christ, if you'll come to him with a penitent faith, to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins, you become part of the bride of Christ, as he would put it in Ephesians chapter 5. Or maybe as a New Testament Christian, we're walking in conflict with God because our lives are not what they should be. And the one thing we do know is if someone is at conflict with God, we know for certain God is not at fault. But he is extremely gracious. And he will forgive us. And if we will come to him this morning, he will be there for us. If we can help you this morning, let us know as we stand and sing this song.